The night had been silent for so long that even the creak of the old wood beneath his steps felt like an intrusion. The house stood still, bathed in the dull amber of the hearth's dying light. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows like a memory too stubborn to fade. Callan had wandered these halls countless nights since Alone passed, his late wife, his once melody of peace, but tonight felt different. Something had broken that silence. Something familiar, but impossible. He had woken not to the cry of his daughter or the ache of insomnia, but to a sound more delicate than breath itself, a lullaby. Not just any lullaby. Her lullaby. The one she had written by hand, never recorded, never shared. The one she had sung only for their daughter, nestled in the quiet of nights long gone. It had been buried with her. Or so he thought. Callan stepped into the hallway, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor, every step heavier than the last. He didn't need the lights, he knew every inch of this place, as if the walls themselves bore the shape of his grief. But the closer he got to the nursery, the clearer the melody became, flowing with a purity so haunting it made his heart seize. The door was cracked open. A soft moon-shaped nightlight cast a glow over the crib. Marin, his daughter, slept peacefully, her tiny hand curled into the blanket. And there, sitting in the old wooden rocker beside the window, was the housekeeper. Lyra Noel. She was dressed in a plain white nightgown, her brown hair loose over her shoulders, her face soft and distant as she sang. She wasn't looking at the baby. She wasn't looking at anything at all. Just singing. Her voice was untrained but unwavering, raw but true, so true it sent a tremor through Callan's chest. He stood frozen at the doorframe, his hand instinctively pressing against his heart. That melody. How? How could she know it? The final line, the one that Alone had written last, the one she whispered only once before the cancer took her, was never supposed to be known by anyone else. And yet here it was, falling from the lips of a stranger. His keys slipped from his hand and clinked against the floor, a sharp, sudden sound that broke the spell. Lyra turned. She didn't flinch. Didn't stammer. Just looked at him, with an expression that made the air between them feel thicker than smoke. "Where did you hear that?" His voice cracked. "I heard it once," she said, as if recalling a dream. "From someone who believed that music never dies." Her answer wasn't an answer. It was a riddle with a heartbeat. She stood, walked toward him, her gaze not challenging, but heavy with something unnamed. She passed him in silence, brushing by like a ghost, and disappeared down the hallway. The door closed behind her, not with a click, but with the hush of something sacred ending too soon. Callan stepped inside the nursery. Marin still slept, one tiny hand wrapped around the hem of Lyra's gown, left behind like a trace of something pure. A drawer beside the crib was slightly open. Inside it, the green leather journal, Alone's journal, lay open. His breath caught as he saw the page. Her handwriting, slanted and sure, untouched for years. Except now it wasn't Alone. Beneath Alone's final line, written in ink that had bled from tears or time, was a new sentence. It read, "A song only lives if someone remembers how to sing it." Callan dropped to the floor, his face in his hands, the room tilting around him in silence. Not the silence of grief. Not the silence of loss. But something deeper. A silence that had been waiting all this time to speak. And now that it had, it wasn't going to stop. That night, he didn't sleep. Not from sadness, and not from fear. But because his body no longer knew what to do with a silence that had found a voice. When morning came, the house didn't feel lighter. It felt suspended. Like it was waiting for something. Or someone. The kind of stillness that followed a question too big to ask out loud. He brewed coffee but forgot it on the stove. Opened the paper but folded it again. His thoughts weren't scattered, they were anchored to one note, one voice, one impossible memory. And when Lyra stepped into the kitchen, hair tied loosely back, eyes calm as ever, he didn't greet her. He just asked, low and cold, that song. Who taught it to you? She held the pancake mix midair, then slowly placed it down. She didn't flinch. Didn't lie. But her words came slowly, like she was pulling them through a fog. Some melodies drift between the world and memory, she said. I just happened to catch one. That song was private, Callan said. His voice sharper now. Elone wrote it when she was pregnant. No one else knew it. She met his eyes. Not defiant. Not afraid. Just still. Sometimes, she said, music isn't meant to be owned. Only returned. He turned away, chest tight, fists clenched, 1,000 thoughts storming through his head. He didn't ask her anything else. He didn't want to know. Not yet. But deep down, something had already shifted. Because for the first time since Elone's death, the house wasn't echoing with silence. It was humming. Softly. Like something sacred had been stirred. And in that hum, a question began to rise inside him, quiet and unrelenting. Who was Lyra Noel really? He just didn't know yet. That he already had the answer. 6 years earlier, the world hadn't gone silent yet. Back then, Callan Lancaster wasn't the hollow-eyed man he would become. He was 39, not yet a father, not yet a widower, not yet cracked down the center by a grief too wide to mend. He was a man too focused on outcomes to notice melodies, a man who believed in control and strategy and not once in fate. It was late October, the kind of crisp New York night where breath turned silver and headlights painted long shadows across the city's slick streets. Callan had been forced, no, manipulated, into attending a gala honoring young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. Apex Innovations, his company, had funded the scholarships, and the press expected him to smile about it. He hated these nights. The suits. The fake laughter. The endless handshakes. He was about to leave early, like always, when a soft sound drew him back from the edge of the lobby. Someone was singing. Not performing. Not belting. Just singing. It wasn't part of the program. No stage lights. No microphone. Just a voice, rising above the clinking of wine glasses and the hum of conversation. Gentle. Raw. Woven with something that didn't belong to the room's glamour, truth. He followed it. In a side hall near the catering station, he saw her. A girl, no, a young woman, no older than 22, with a thin frame and long chestnut hair that curled naturally over her shoulder. She stood facing away, humming as she reorganized trays on a cart. Her uniform was modest, her shoes scuffed, and her hands were shaking slightly as she worked. The melody stopped when she realized someone was there. She turned around too quickly and a wine glass tipped from the tray. Reflexively, Callan stepped forward and caught it midair. Their hands brushed. She looked up. Her eyes were wide and startled, but not afraid. There was something else in them. Recognition. Thank you, she said, voice soft. I didn't see you. I noticed, he replied, more coldly than intended. She smiled at that. A small one. Polite. Faintly amused. Then turned back to the tray. He stood for a moment, watching her. He wasn't sure why. He didn't even know her name. But something about the way she moved, the stillness in her despite the noise around her, held him there. Before he could say anything else, a supervisor appeared behind her and barked orders. The girl flinched, mumbled an apology, and wheeled the cart away. She never looked back. That should have been the end of it. But as Callan returned to the main hall, the sound of her humming followed him like a thread wrapped around his ribs. He didn't even realize he was looking for her until it was time to leave and he scanned the staff corners one last time, hoping, unreasonably, that she would be there again. She wasn't. The next morning, he asked his assistant to find out who handled catering. Just curious, he said. They had good logistics. That was a lie. He didn't care about the food. He wanted to know her name. But the assistant returned with no list. They subcontracted last minute. Some agency. I'll keep digging, sir. And Callan let it go. He told himself it didn't matter. He had empires to build, stockholders to please, schedules to keep. He didn't have time to chase after voices in hallways. Weeks passed. Then months. And still, sometimes, when the office was quiet and he was the last one there, he would hear that humming in his head. No words. Just a tune. Then came Alone. He met her at a lecture on artificial ethics at Columbia. She was brilliant, beautiful, and unapologetically kind. She challenged him, teased him, taught him how to slow down. She didn't hum lullabies, but she spoke like every sentence mattered. And he let her in. Fell in love. Proposed within 8 months. She wrote music as a hobby. Scribbled songs in green leather journals. Never played them in public, never wanted to. They're just for me, she'd say, curling up beside him on stormy nights. And maybe for Maren, when she comes. That was her name before she was born. Maren. A name Alone said came to her in a dream, a melody in the middle of silence. Callan didn't question it. Didn't ask where the tune came from. And then, one day, he came home to find her sitting at the piano with tears on her cheeks and a notebook open in front of her. She closed it when he walked in. He never asked. Because asking meant opening the door to a sorrow he didn't know how to hold. When Maren was born, Alone sang only one lullaby to her. Over and over. She never recorded it. Never let anyone else hear it. And when she died, the song died with her. Or so he believed. But now, 6 years later, that same song had been sung by Lyra Noel. A woman who had never met Alone. A woman he hadn't recognized when she first applied for the housekeeper job. A woman who had looked him straight in the eye on her first day, introduced herself with nothing more than a nod and a folded resume, and something in her tone had stirred something he hadn't named. He should have known. He should have remembered. But the past has a way of disguising itself until it decides you're ready. And Callan Lancaster had never been ready. Until now. The apartment was small, just one room with a kitchenette tucked into the far wall and a window that barely let in light, but Lyra had made it feel like a home. The morning sun touched the chipped tile floor with a warmth it didn't quite own, but she took comfort in it anyway. A pot of herbal tea simmered gently on the stove, filling the air with something soft, something steady. Something she could control. Maren's old stuffed bunny sat on the edge of the couch, its ears sewn back on with red thread Lyra had found in a charity bin. The same red thread she'd once worn as a bracelet, long before she arrived in this city. Long before she knew the man who now haunted every breath of silence in that house. She sat at the small table, a sketchpad open in front of her. Inside, pressed neatly between pages of melody lines and unfinished verses, was a single photograph. Worn at the edges. The colors faded. A candid snapshot, taken on a rainy day, capturing a younger version of herself standing beneath a canopy with a man who had no idea he'd once promised to remember her forever. Callan. Back when he didn't even ask her name. She hadn't meant to keep the photo all these years. It wasn't hers, she had found it years after the moment had passed, in the pages of an old event program someone had thrown away. She didn't need the image. She remembered every second. Back then, she had been nobody. Just another catering assistant in a second-hand uniform, working 3 jobs to stay afloat after leaving school. Her dreams had been quiet then, fragile things held together with hope and duct tape. She still believed music could change lives. Still thought a single night of kindness might mean something. She'd hummed because she was nervous. Because the trays were slippery. Because the only thing that calmed her was melody. And he had walked in like a thunderclap. caught the glass, looked at her like she was something real. And then, he left. Just like everyone else. She hadn't expected him to stay. Hadn't expected him to remember. But something in her, a part she didn't know how to silence, had held on to that moment like it was more than what it was. And then years passed. She saw his name in business articles, interviews, magazine profiles where he was always called the brilliant but distant CEO. She saw the wedding announcement, the baby photos, the obituary. She watched a life unfold that she was never part of, always on the outside looking in. And when she saw the name Marin in a headline about the scholarship foundation Alone Thorne had set up before her passing, her stomach twisted. Because Alone had spoken of that name once, years earlier, during a single sleepless night in the dorm they'd once shared, back when Lyra was still at the conservatory. They hadn't been lovers. Not quite. But they'd been more than friends. Shared music. Shared secrets. Shared the ache of being invisible in a world that only listened when you screamed. Alone had written that lullaby the night her father died. She'd played it softly on the piano in the practice room, tears slipping down her cheeks, and Lyra had recorded it, not for anyone else. Just so she wouldn't forget. But the file was corrupted. Years later, when Lyra tried to find it, all that remained was the echo of memory. Still, she remembered the tune. And then Alone disappeared from her life, got married, had a child, built a quiet world Lyra wasn't invited into. No bitterness. Just silence. Until the silence shattered. Lyra had come to the house under a false name, with references that checked out only because no one really looked. She hadn't planned on staying. She just wanted to see the girl. The daughter of the only person who had ever sung to her like it mattered. But when she first saw Marin, curled beneath a blanket with her late mother's eyes and her father's quiet, guarded stare, something inside Lyra crumbled. And then, one night, she sang. She hadn't meant to. The melody came out like breath, like prayer, like regret. And when she opened her eyes and saw Callan standing there, watching, frozen, she felt the truth press against her like a storm. She should have run then. But she didn't. Now, sitting alone in the apartment she never unpacked fully, she stared at the green leather journal she hadn't dared return. She'd copied the last page the night before. The words were still ringing in her mind, "If your father has no words left to say, sing him this line and his heart will remember." She remembered the day Alone wrote that line. She had been curled on the dorm room floor, a mug of mint tea in her hand, writing by the light of a cracked lamp. She'd asked Lyra, "Do you think music can survive even if no one plays it?" Lyra had said yes. She wasn't so sure anymore. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Soft. Hesitant. She stood, unsure, and crossed to the door. Through the peephole, a courier. She opened it halfway. "Package for Lyra Noel," the man said. "From Apex Innovations." She froze. I didn't order anything. Signature required. She signed. Inside was a simple envelope. No return address. She opened it slowly, heart thudding. Inside, a note. Handwritten. Just one line. "You said music never dies. But some of us need to hear it again to believe that." Below that, another line. Scrawled in a different pen. "I don't know who you are. But I'm starting to remember something I didn't realize I forgot." She stared at it for a long time. Then she whispered to no one, "He's waking up." And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a stranger anymore. The rain hadn't let up all week. It tapped endlessly against the glass like a child too polite to knock, but too persistent to ignore. In the heart of the city, where office windows blurred into one another and no one looked up unless the sky fell, Callan sat at his desk, unmoving. His laptop blinked a cursor on a blank document. His phone buzzed with a dozen ignored calls. The morning meetings had been cancelled. He hadn't said why. He just didn't show. The letter still sat on his nightstand, folded once, neatly. He'd read it a dozen times already, tracing each word as if the paper might whisper something more if touched the right way. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. He knew. Lyra. He said her name once, out loud, just to hear how it felt. It hung there in the air, strange and soft, like a note played on an unfamiliar instrument. He remembered the way she had sung, raw and untrained, but honest. More honest than anything he'd heard in years. More honest than his boardroom speeches, than the silence he wore like armor, than the polite condolences strangers had offered at Alone's funeral. And that voice, that melody, had stirred something he had buried deep, beneath years of control and the discipline of forgetting. That night, he searched the house. Not frantically. Quietly. Like retracing steps in a dream. He opened closets. Pulled drawers. Walked into the study he hadn't entered in months. The green leather journal was still where it had always been. Except now it felt different. Not like a memory, but like a message. He flipped through the pages, as if each one were a breath he had once ignored. There were songs, scribbled recipes, little notes for Maren, reminders to record her laugh, to take a photo of her first steps. And there, near the back, Alone's handwriting curved in its familiar tilt. But below it, in smaller script, was something new. Lyra's handwriting. He didn't know how, but he did. It was sharper. More deliberate. As if every letter had been a decision, not a reflex. She had added just a single sentence. If the music returns, don't ask how. Ask why it waited for you. He closed the journal slowly. Later that afternoon, he told the driver to cancel his appointments. He stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, the drops clinging to his face like fingerprints. He didn't go far. Just walked. Past the building where he and Alone had once picked out nursery colors. Past the bakery she loved but never got to return to. Past the alley where they'd once ducked from a storm and kissed like teenagers. And as he passed each place, the melody came back to him, note by note, haunting and relentless. Back at home, Maren asked to hear the lullaby again. He couldn't sing it. Not like her mother. Not like Lyra. So he played a recording from his phone. One he hadn't even realized he'd saved. Lyra's voice filled the room, unsteady but true. Maren curled into his side, whispering, "Miss Lyra sings like mommy." He stiffened. "What do you mean?" Maren shrugged, her eyelids heavy. "They sound the same." "Kind of." That night, after she slept, Callan sat by the fire and stared at the photo above the mantel, Alone holding Maren, mid-laugh, her hair falling into her face. She had known Lyra once. He was sure of it now. It wasn't just a coincidence. That lullaby wasn't something anyone could guess. There was history there. Something he hadn't seen. Or had chosen not to see. He started searching. Not just online. He dug through Alone's old files. Her university records. Her scholarship forms. Email archives. A folder marked conservatory, winter session. Inside was a photo. 2 young women, seated at a piano. One was clearly Alone. The other. Lyra. Younger. Her eyes softer, her smile freer. The caption, Duet, Alone Thorne and Lyra Noel, Honors Recital, 2014. He stared at it for a long time, unable to decide if he felt betrayed, or relieved. They'd known each other. Intimately. Deeply. Before him. Before Maren. A part of Alone he had never asked about. Because he never thought he needed to. And now that piece had come back, singing lullabies in the night and leaving without a trace. The next morning, he arrived at the apartment building her letter had been postmarked from. He didn't know which unit. He just waited in the lobby, hoping for something that might never come. It wasn't her who appeared. It was the landlord. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone," Callan said. "Lyra Noel." The landlord frowned. "She moved out yesterday." His heart dropped. "Left no forwarding address?" "No. But she did leave this." He pulled something from a drawer behind the desk. A small envelope. Unmarked. Sealed. Callan took it with shaking hands. Inside, a single photo. The same photo he had found in the conservatory files. But this copy had something scrawled on the back in the same slanted handwriting he remembered from Alone's journals. "She knew you'd forget. But she never stopped hoping you'd remember." He didn't sleep that night. Didn't eat. Didn't speak. He just sat on the floor of the nursery, Marin curled in his lap, the lullaby playing quietly on repeat. Not from memory. From truth. And for the first time in years, he wept. Not from grief. But from guilt. And something far more dangerous. Need. Because now, he knew. Lyra Noel wasn't just a stranger who knew a song. She was the only person left who still remembered the version of Alone that even he had never truly known. And somehow, she had given that part of Alone back to Marin, to him, without asking for anything in return. He had to find her. Even if it meant tearing down everything he thought he understood about his past. Even if it meant finally admitting what he had buried for too long. That sometimes, love doesn't vanish. It just waits in the quiet, until someone is brave enough to hear it again. The rain had slowed to a whisper by the time Callan stood outside the music school on 48th Street. He hadn't been there in years, not since cutting the ceremonial ribbon on the new conservatory wing his company helped fund. Back then, it was just another photo op, a well-lit moment to prove Apex had a heart. He never imagined he'd return seeking answers that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with a lullaby that wouldn't leave him alone. The woman at the front desk barely looked up when he approached. "We're closed for student auditions today," she said flatly. "I'm not here to audition," he said, voice low. "I'm looking for records. Old recital programs, maybe recordings. From 10 years ago." She gave him a look, suspicious but curious. "Which year?" "Winter session. 2014. She squinted. "That's, going way back. What's the name?" He hesitated, then said it carefully, like each syllable might change the air around him. "Lyra Noel. And the Lone Thorn." The receptionist frowned, typed something on her keyboard, then disappeared into a side office. Minutes passed. He paced, unable to sit still. His chest was tight, like something important was about to break loose, and he wasn't sure if he wanted it to. Finally, she returned, carrying a thin folder. "We don't have much," she said. "Just the original program and a photo. No recordings on file. We didn't start digitizing until 2016. Callan took the folder gently, almost reverently. He flipped it open. The program was printed on thick cream paper, now yellowing at the edges. There it was, duet performance, Lyra Noel and Alone Thorn, Winter's Sleep, original composition. His eyes dropped to the bottom of the page. A quote. "Some melodies don't ask to be written. They arrive, demanding to be remembered. No attribution. Just floating there like a secret between two souls." Beside the program, the photo again. Alone at the piano, eyes closed. Lyra beside her, one hand resting lightly on the keys, the other clutching the edge of the bench like she was holding on for dear life. They weren't smiling for the camera. They weren't aware of it at all. They were inside the music. Callan swallowed hard and closed the folder. He didn't remember Alone ever mentioning Lyra. But that didn't mean she hadn't tried. It just meant he hadn't asked. Or worse, hadn't listened. That evening, he returned to the office for the first time in days. The teen barely looked up when he passed through the halls, soaked in silence and the afterglow of revelation. His assistant started to say something, but he waved it off and locked himself in his office. He sat behind his desk, staring at the skyline, the glass reflecting his own hollow face. And then, almost without thinking, he opened the drawer on the left side of his desk. Inside, a black folder he hadn't touched in years. Elon's will. He pulled it out, thumbed through the pages until he reached the addendum she'd added during her pregnancy. A section titled, Personal Wishes. There, in Elon's careful script, was a list of things she wanted for Maren. The name of the pediatrician. A note about Montessori schools. And one sentence that stopped him cold. If Maren ever needs someone to remind her of music, let her be with the person who first gave it to me. No name. Just that. He closed the folder. And for the first time since Elon died, Callan felt something that resembled clarity. Lyra hadn't come into his house by accident. She hadn't stumbled into their lives. She had been chosen. By the one woman he thought he knew completely. But he didn't know where she had gone. She had vanished like a ghost with a heartbeat, real enough to matter, but just out of reach. He scoured her file again. Her emergency contact was blank. Her resume led to a now-defunct agency. No relatives listed. Just a handwritten note on her application, available anytime. Seeking quiet work. It made sense now. She wasn't running from something. She was mourning in silence. The same way he had. 3 nights later, Maren woke up screaming. Callan sprinted to her room, heart pounding. She sat up in bed, hair matted to her forehead, sobbing. What happened? He asked, kneeling beside her. I had a bad dream, she whimpered. Miss Lyra was in it. And she was leaving. But she didn't want to. She hiccuped, she just waved and said she wasn't allowed to stay. He pulled her into his arms, held her close. It's okay. It was just a dream. But she sang the song, Maren whispered. The one Mommy used to sing. And then she disappeared. Callan felt something inside him fracture again. Maren clung to his shirt. Why did she go away? He couldn't answer. He kissed her hair, tucked her in, and stood at the doorway for a long moment before leaving the room. Downstairs, in the study, he pulled the journal back out. This time, he didn't flip to the song. He turned to the blank page at the very back. The one Elon had left untouched. And with a pen that had sat unused for years, he began to write. Not a song. Not a letter. Just one line. If you remember the melody, please come home. We never stopped listening. The next morning, he made a copy. And sent it to the only address he could find still tied to her name. A tiny music supply store in upstate New York where she'd once bought a second-hand keyboard under an old scholarship fund. He didn't know if it would reach her. But he knew one thing with certainty. She had carried a piece of Elon's soul. And now, that piece, was the only thing that could teach Maren how to sing again. He folded the letter. Sealed it. And wrote the name on the front like a prayer. The train hummed along the tracks with a rhythmic persistence, as if trying to sing a lullaby of its own. Lyra sat by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the letter resting inside her bag like it might burn a hole through the canvas. She hadn't opened it. Not yet. But she knew who had written it. The moment she saw the handwriting on the envelope, her breath had caught in her chest like a bird too afraid to fly. The store owner had handed it to her with a look of curiosity she didn't question. You've got someone looking for you, sweetheart, she'd said. Big envelope. No return address, but the way it's sealed. That's someone who still cares. Lyra had nodded. Thanked her. Walked out into the chill of the upstate air and sat on the bench across from the bus stop for nearly an hour before deciding to leave town. Not because she had a destination, but because she was tired of hiding in places where the walls didn't echo with music. Now, the countryside blurred past her window, fields faded to gold, barns leaning with age, and the occasional glimpse of quiet lives lived without questions or ghosts. She envied those lives. When the train pulled into the city, she didn't go to the address right away. She walked for hours. Down streets that once felt familiar. Past the old conservatory, the coffee shop where she and Alone had studied chord progression, the bookstore where she used to write lyrics in the margins of sheet music she couldn't afford. Everything was still there. And everything had changed. As evening fell, she found herself outside a townhouse in the quiet part of the city. The lights were on. Not bright. Just enough to hint at warmth behind the curtains. She recognized the window with the soft yellow glow. Marin's room. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope at last. Just one line. If you remember the melody, please come home. We never stopped listening. There was no name. No plea. Just presence. And that was enough. She knocked. When Callan opened the door, he didn't speak. He stood there, silent, unsure whether to reach for her or step back. His eyes were tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of memory. I didn't know where else to go, she said quietly. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, he replied. She stepped inside. The house hadn't changed. But it felt different. Like someone had opened a window that had been closed for years. She glanced around. Her bag still hung on the hook in the hallway. Her tea mug sat washed and dried on the shelf. Her presence, though absent, hadn't been erased. He led her to the kitchen. She sat while he made tea, his movements careful, like every motion was part of an unfamiliar dance. Finally, he spoke. I found the photo. From the recital. She looked up slowly. I should have known then, he continued, but I didn't ask. I never asked Alone about that part of her life. She didn't hide it from you, Lyra said gently. She just didn't know how to explain something that didn't need explaining. Music isn't always about sharing. Sometimes it's about holding. Callan nodded, absorbing that. You knew her better than I did. No, Lyra whispered. I just knew her, before. A silence stretched between them, not heavy, but raw. I was angry, he admitted. Not at you. At myself. For not seeing the pieces until after they were scattered. Lyra smiled faintly. Some songs only make sense after the last note's been played. Upstairs, a soft shuffle of feet. Then Marin's voice. Daddy? Callan stood. She's been asking for the song every night. But I can't sing it the way her mother did. The way you did. Lyra's expression softened. You don't have to sing it. You just have to listen. He led her up the stairs. Marin stood in the doorway in her pajamas, hair tousled, eyes wide. When she saw Lyra, she broke into a run. You came back, she breathed, wrapping her arms around her waist. Lyra knelt down and hugged her tight. I missed you too much to stay away. The girl beamed. Can we sing? Lyra looked at Callan. He nodded. They settled into the nursery. Marin climbed into her bed, pulling the blanket to her chin. Lyra sat in the rocker, the way she had that first night. This time, she didn't hum. She sang. And the room changed. Not visually. But deeply. The air thickened with memory and something gentler, acceptance. The song poured from her like it had been waiting inside all this time, aching to be heard. Callan stood in the doorway, unmoving. Then, slowly, he walked over and sat on the floor beside Marin's bed. When the final note faded, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt whole. Marin had fallen asleep, a tiny smile on her lips. Lyra stood, eyes glassy. Callan rose too. He looked at her. Stay. She hesitated. I don't know where I fit anymore. He stepped closer. Maybe you were never meant to fit. Maybe you were meant to return. She didn't reply. She didn't have to. The decision was in the way she reached for his hand. And the way he didn't let go. The days that followed felt like breathing underwater, quiet, suspended, yet impossibly vivid. Callan moved through them as if relearning how to exist in his own house. Each morning, he found himself listening before his feet hit the floor, half expecting that soft, untrained voice to rise again from the rocker in the nursery. And sometimes it did. Sometimes Lyra sang even when Maren had already drifted to sleep, her voice curling around the walls like a memory trying to heal what silence had left behind. But nothing stayed still for long. One afternoon, while Lyra folded laundry in the den and Maren played with crayons on the floor, Callan received a call from his legal team. It wasn't unusual. But the voice on the other end was tense. Mr. Lancaster, the lawyer said, we were conducting a routine audit of archived contracts related to the Apex Artists program. A file from the 2014 cohort raised questions. There's a signature discrepancy on one of the scholarships. The recipient listed is Lyra Noel. Callan's heart dropped. And, he asked cautiously. The application was submitted under her name, but the supporting documents, letters of recommendation, the composition samples, some of them appear to be written by Alone Thorne. His voice went quiet. I'll look into it, he muttered, ending the call. He didn't say anything to Lyra that night. Not when she placed a plate in front of him at dinner. Not when she tucked Maren in with the same tenderness he remembered from Alone. He watched her silently, trying to reconcile the woman who now hummed while washing dishes with the shadowy figure in those faded recital photos. But his mind was already unspooling threads. Back in his study, he pulled out Alone's green leather journal again. He turned to the composition pages and scanned the handwriting. Then he pulled the folder of scholarship files his assistant had dug up days ago. The letters of recommendation for Lyra. The phrasing. The tone. The slant of the ink. They weren't just similar. They were identical. The night pressed in heavy around him as he sat at the piano, Alone's piano, and stared at the sheet music left behind, his thoughts a thundering storm. Was it fraud? Was it charity? Was it love? He didn't know anymore. All he knew was that the pieces didn't fit the way he thought they did. And maybe they never had. Underscore 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 underscore. The next day, he took Maren to school. On the way back, he didn't return home. He drove to the conservatory. A different receptionist this time. Younger. Bright-eyed. I need access to the alumni files from 2014, he said, flashing his credentials. Lyra Noel and Alone Thorne. The girl hesitated. I'll need permission. I funded your West Wing, he said bluntly. You'll have it. She left, and when she returned, she handed over a single envelope. He opened it on the bench outside. Inside, a photo he hadn't seen before. Lyra and Alone, lying on the grass beneath a tree, a shared journal between them. Alone had her eyes closed, a pencil tucked behind one ear. Lyra was laughing, mouth wide, head tilted back, free in a way Callan had never seen in her now. And there, beneath the photo, a handwritten note. LNT. You said music finds the right ears at the right time. If you're reading this, I guess you were right. His fingers shook. Alone had written this. Not as a goodbye. As a map. To her past. To the part of herself Callan had never asked to see. That evening, Lyra found him in the study, sitting with the photo between his fingers. She stepped into the doorway slowly, sensing something had shifted. He didn't look up. "You applied for the Apex scholarship using Alone's materials." She didn't flinch. "Yes. And you never told me." "There was never a right time," she whispered. He stood, crossing the room. "Why? Why would she give you her work?" "She didn't," Lyra said quietly. "We wrote them together. The melodies were mine. The language was hers." He searched her eyes, wanting to find deception, but finding only grief. "You were in love with her," he said. Lyra looked down, her voice barely audible. "We both were. Just, in different ways." Callan's chest tightened. "You shared something I didn't even know existed. That doesn't make your love any less real." "But it makes mine incomplete," he whispered. Silence pulsed between them like a heartbeat. "I didn't come here to ruin anything," she said. "I came because Maren deserved to hear her mother's song again. And because a part of me hoped, maybe foolishly, that I could find closure." He stepped back, his voice low. "Did she love you?" Lyra met his gaze. "Yes. But she chose you." Tears stung his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. "I keep asking myself," he said hoarsely, "if I ever really knew her." Lyra moved closer. "You knew the part of her that wanted safety. A future. A family. I knew the part of her that was still wild, still aching. She gave different pieces of herself to different people. That's not betrayal. That's just being human." He looked away, voice cracking. "I loved her. I thought I was enough. You were. For the part of her that needed you most." He turned, finally facing her. "And what about the part that sang that lullaby? The one you kept alive?" Lyra's eyes filled, but she smiled, soft, sad. "That part never wanted to be buried. It just needed someone who remembered." She reached into her coat pocket and handed him a notebook. Not Alone's. Her own. "I wrote something," she said. "A second verse. It's not perfect. But it's honest." He took it, fingers brushing hers. "Will you sing it?" he asked. Her voice trembled. "If you'll listen." And in that moment, they both knew. This was no longer about the past. It was about a song still unfinished. And two people brave enough to write the next line. It rained again the next morning. The kind of rain that blurred the skyline and erased the spaces between street lamps, as if the world itself were trying to forget. Callan stood by the window in Maren's room, watching droplets slide down the glass, one after another, falling like moments he could no longer catch. Lyra's notebook sat open on the coffee table in the den downstairs. He hadn't touched it again since the night before. Hadn't turned the page. Hadn't dared. Because the song, the one she said was a second verse, wasn't just a lullaby. It was something else. A confession. A memory. A key. And part of him feared that if he read it, he'd have to face a version of Alone that lived in places he was never invited. He'd spent years building walls against grief. Polishing his routine into a shield. Waking up at 5. Coffee. Silence. Numbers. Emails. Meetings. A picture of Alone on the mantle. A bedtime story for Maren. And then back to the silence again. He had managed, somehow, to live around the absence. But Lyra, she didn't live around it. She sang through it. He left the room quietly and walked downstairs. She was there, curled up on the sofa, asleep beneath a woven blanket Maren had dragged down from the closet. Her head rested on one arm, strands of hair falling across her face like a curtain she no longer bothered to keep in place. Her breath was steady. Unbothered. peaceful. He sat across from her and picked up the notebook. The page was lined in dark blue ink, the edges smudged where her hand had rested. At the top, a single phrase. For the part of her that still lingers in the quiet. He read the lyrics once. Then again. And when he reached the last line, something inside him cracked. It was Alone's voice, yes. But it was also Lyra's. The way Alone used to play with rhythm and leave space between words, trusting the silence to say what she couldn't. And the way Lyra bent melody to emotion, never perfect, but always true. And between them, a message. A truth he hadn't let himself face. The song wasn't just a memory. It was a promise. He stood and walked into the kitchen. The rain still tapped on the windows, a rhythm he suddenly heard differently. He brewed tea. Not because he needed it, but because she would. She stirred just as he placed the cup in front of her. Lyra blinked, sitting up. Her voice was rough with sleep. "What time is it?" "Still early," he said. "But I read it." Her eyes dropped to the notebook. "And you knew her," he said. "In a way I never did. But the strange part is, it doesn't hurt the way I thought it would." She looked up, wary. "No." He shook his head slowly. "No. Because I think I needed to know the whole song. Not just the part she gave me." Lyra wrapped the blanket tighter. "There's still more you don't know." Callan studied her, that quiet storm in her eyes rising. "Tell me." She hesitated, then spoke with care. "I didn't apply for that scholarship just because I needed it. I applied because she asked me to. Because she said, if something ever happened to her, she wanted you to remember the part of her that could never be printed in magazines or tied to a last name." His throat tightened. "You mean, she planned for this?" She didn't know how or when. But she knew the song might disappear with her. And she didn't want that. She wanted someone to keep it alive. He turned away, overwhelmed by the layers unfolding. She wrote a second journal, Lyra added quietly. "One I never showed you." His head snapped back toward her. "It wasn't about you. Or Marin. It was about her fears. Her past. The things she couldn't tell you without breaking the version of herself she thought you needed." "Where is it?" "I gave it to the Foundation's archives," she whispered. "Under her name. Sealed. I thought it wasn't my place to open that door again." A long silence followed. Finally, Callan said, "I want to read it. Not to rewrite who she was. Just to, finally meet the parts of her I never looked for." Lyra gave a small, sad smile. "Then you're already doing what she hoped." That afternoon, Marin drew pictures in the living room while Lyra played gentle chords on the piano. Callan watched them from the hallway, unseen. Lyra's fingers moved across the keys with careful grace, the way someone touches a scar that no longer hurts but still remembers. And Marin, unprompted, began to hum. The same melody. The one from the song. Callan's breath caught. He stepped into the room. "I want to record it," he said. Lyra paused. "The lullaby?" "All of it," he replied. "Your verse." Her verse. Marin's voice. She studied him. "Why?" He swallowed. "Because someday, she'll grow up. And I want her to know the truth. The whole thing. The mother who loved her. The friend who kept that love alive. The father who took too long to understand." Lyra stood. "Then we'll record it. Together." They booked a small studio on the east side. Nothing fancy. Just a room with warm acoustics, a single mic, and the hum of possibility. That night, as they stood in the recording booth, Lyra handed Callan a pair of headphones. Marin sat on a stool, legs swinging, clutching a small toy rabbit. Lyra whispered, you start. Callan blinked. I don't sing. You don't have to, she said. Just speak. Speak the part you never said. So he did. His voice shook, but he said the words anyway. I thought silence would keep me safe. But all it did was keep me empty. Alone. I'm sorry I didn't see all of you. And Marin. I'm sorry I didn't know how to sing your mother's song. But I'm learning now. Because of her. Because of Lyra. And because of you. Lyra nodded. Then played the first note. And together, in that small room, they gave breath to a song that had lived too long in the quiet. It was raw. Imperfect. Honest. And when they finished, no one spoke. Because some melodies aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be remembered. And now, finally, they would be. The recording session had ended hours ago, but the weight of it lingered like a fog that refused to lift. Callan sat in the back seat of the car as it cruised silently down Fifth Avenue, the city lights blinking past like ghosted versions of moments he couldn't return to. In his hands, he held the flash drive, the song, frozen in time, sealed in sound. It was small, insignificant in appearance. But to him, it held a universe. When he arrived home, the house was quiet. Lyra had taken Marin out for the evening, a promise she'd made before the session. Just the two of us, she'd said. A little music, maybe a cupcake. And now, with the door closing behind him and the walls pressing inward, Callan realized what silence truly meant. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the absence of her. Not alone. Lyra. He poured himself a glass of water and didn't drink it. His reflection in the kitchen window looked more like his father than he was willing to admit, tired eyes, too many regrets etched into the lines around his mouth, and a stiffness in his shoulders that came from carrying things he was never meant to carry alone. He sat at the piano bench, the keys untouched since that morning. And suddenly, the tears came. Not as a flood. As a surrender. He let them fall. Let them carve down his face without shame. Because he was done holding back. Done pretending that understanding came easily. Done believing that love could survive untouched by time, loss, or the terrible silence between words left unsaid. When he finally rose from the bench, his limbs heavy, he walked into the study. The journal still lay open, Lyra's page visible. But this time, he flipped to the back. To the one page alone had left blank. And wrote. I didn't know how to keep all of you. But I'm ready now. I'm ready to learn what I missed. Even if it takes the rest of my life. He closed the journal and placed it gently on the bookshelf beside her favorite poetry. Then he pulled out his phone. He called the school board. He called the foundation. He called the boardroom that used to define his entire existence. And in a steady voice, he said what he never thought he would. I'm taking a leave of absence. Indefinitely. The next morning, he drove across the city. Stopped at a flower stand. Bought lavender, Alone's favorite. Daisies, Marin's favorite. And lilies, because Lyra once said they reminded her of music. He arrived at the cemetery just as the clouds began to thin. He placed the bouquet beside the headstone, his fingers brushing the cool stone. I'm sorry it took me this long, he whispered. You trusted her. You trusted me. And I almost lost both. There was no reply, only the rustle of wind through nearby trees. He stood there for a long time, his heart unclenching bit by bit. Then, finally, he turned back toward the car. When he arrived home, Lyra and Marin were sitting on the living room floor, stringing beads into necklaces. Marin ran to him immediately, throwing her arms around his legs. Daddy! Look what we made. He smiled, crouched, and kissed the top of her head. Lyra looked up from the floor, her eyes questioning, not with fear, but with a quiet, vulnerable hope. I left something in your room, he said to Maren. Why don't you go look? When the child darted off, Callan crossed the room and sat beside Lyra. I went to see alone today. Lyra didn't speak. I told her the truth, he continued. That I was late. That I almost missed the music because I thought love could only exist in the parts one understood. Her gaze softened. And now? He exhaled slowly. Now I know love is also in the parts we never dared to ask about. They sat in silence for a moment. Then he turned to her. I meant it when I said I was ready. But I can't do it alone. She looked down, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny velvet pouch. Maren wanted to give this to you tonight. But maybe now is better. Inside was a small charm, hand-painted by Maren. 3 tiny notes drawn across a white heart. A string threaded through it like a necklace. She said, Lyra murmured, it's the heart of her song. Callan swallowed against the tightness in his chest. I thought I'd forgotten how to hear it. You didn't, Lyra said softly. You were just waiting for the right voice to sing it again. He reached for her hand, his grip gentle but sure. Stay. I already have. And for the first time in years, the house felt full, not of memories or echoes, but of presence. Of healing. Of music. The house woke slowly the next morning, bathed in soft winter light that filtered through the windows like forgiveness. The scent of cinnamon from a pot Lyra had set on the stove filled the air, wrapping around the quiet in a way that made the silence feel like a warm blanket rather than a reminder of absence. Maren was the first to break the hush, her small feet padding down the stairs, hair tangled in soft curls, a crooked smile already tugging at her lips. She slipped into the kitchen, climbed onto the stool beside the island, and watched Lyra stirring a pot of oats like it was the most magical thing in the world. I dreamed about Mommy last night, she said sleepily. Lyra turned slowly, her hand stilling. You did? Maren nodded. She was standing in the garden. She was singing. But not alone. You were with her. Lyra didn't answer for a moment. Then, she whispered, maybe she was visiting. Just to see how beautifully you've grown. Callan stood just outside the doorway, listening. He didn't move. Didn't interrupt. He just watched his daughter lean against the woman who had carried a song long buried, watched the quiet unfold between them like a ribbon no longer tied too tightly. After breakfast, they dressed in coats and scarves and walked to the park. The air was crisp but not cruel, and the lake in the center had begun to glaze over with ice. Maren darted ahead, laughing, her boots crunching in the frost-dusted grass. Callan and Lyra strolled behind her. Not touching. Not speaking. Just breathing the same air again. I never expected this, he said softly. Lyra looked sideways at him. Expected what? Another chance, he murmured. At anything. She took a deep breath. Maybe it's not another chance. Maybe it's the first one you were ready for. They stopped at a bench near the pond, and Maren flopped into the seat beside them, her cheeks pink with cold and joy. Can we sing it again tonight? She asked. Callan smiled. Which one? The lullaby, she said. But this time, all 3 of us. Lyra glanced at him, her eyes wide but steady. Do you think you're ready for that? Callan exhaled, the warmth of it curling in the cold. No, he said. But I think that's the point. That night, they lit a candle in the living room and placed the framed sheet music in the center of the rug. Maren arranged 3 cushions in a circle, her tiny hands precise, reverent. Lyra brought the guitar. Callan brought the journal. And together, they began. Lyra started with the first verse, the one alone had written with trembling hope years ago. Maren followed, her voice unsure but growing stronger with each line. Then, Callan read the bridge he had scribbled into the blank page weeks before, a verse that didn't rhyme, didn't scan, but bled truth. And finally, silence. Not the empty kind. The sacred kind. The kind that comes only after something beautiful has ended. Lyra reached across the space between them and took Callan's hand. Do you think she heard it? Marin asked, voice barely above a whisper. Callan tightened his fingers around Lyra's. I think, he said slowly, she was here long before we started. And she'll be here long after we finish. Marin nodded solemnly, as if accepting something even adults struggled to hold. They didn't say goodnight with ceremony that evening. There was no final note. No forced meaning. Just the quiet movement of bodies and breath, of hearts beginning to beat in rhythm again. As Lyra turned off the lights and followed Callan down the hallway, she paused at the nursery door. Marin was already asleep, one hand curled around her stuffed rabbit, the other resting on the music journal now tucked beneath her pillow. She looks like her, Lyra whispered. Callan stopped behind her. I know. But she's also her own song, Lyra said. Not a copy. Not a memory. Something entirely new. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Later that night, as snow began to fall in a hush too sacred for words, Callan stood by the window in the study. The fire crackled softly behind him. The house was no longer silent, not in the way it once was. It breathed now. It hummed. It held. Lyra joined him without speaking, slipping her hand into his again. Outside, the snow gathered on the trees like dust on old music sheets waiting to be played again. Inside, a man who had once believed he'd lost everything had found what he didn't even know he was missing. Not just a woman. Not just a daughter. But a melody that had waited patiently in the stillness. Until someone brave enough chose to sing it again. And this time, it wouldn't be forgotten.